Before we start our review of our reading this past week, we are going to go over the map at the back of your homework packet after the Great War changes in the face of Europe. I'm going to start by pointing out the two maps down at the bottom of the page. I'm going to highlight different sections of the map. You're not required to do this for your homework. I feel like it's important to go ahead and highlight it so that you can visualize what we're talking about, and then we're going to go back up to the top of the page and answer the questions. So first I'd like to highlight Germany before World War I, taking a look at the area that it encompassed, and compare that to Germany after World War I. Notice that Germany has lost land. It's lost a small section to France, the area that says 31, Alsace-Lorraine. Notice that after the war it went to France, and then it lost a larger section to what became Czechoslovakia. It also lost some land to what became Poland. Next, we're going to take a look at the area occupied by Austria-Hungary before the war, and I'm highlighting the same place, and notice there is no Austria-Hungary after the war. There are several other countries in its place, including Czechoslovakia, an independent country called Austria, an independent called Hungary, and then Yugoslavia also is part of that. Next, we're going to highlight Montenegro and Serbia. And notice that after the war, they no longer exist. Turning to Romania before the war, and notice that it took up a lot more space after the war. I'm assuming that's because that there were people who thought of themselves as Romanian that had at one point been conquered by the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and that land was probably given back to the Romanian people after the war. And then we're going to highlight Bulgaria. Before the war, notice that it has a harbor area to the Mediterranean Sea, and after the war it no longer has a harbor area. It has lost territory to Greece. So we're going to go back up to the top and we're going to answer the questions after making those observations at the bottom. So it says, under the Treaty of Versailles, several European nations gained and lost land. Looking at the two maps below, answer the following questions. Number one, what two nations gained land that had been part of Germany? And we already know that France and Poland were the main ones. Number two, what region did France gain from Germany? We know that that is Alsace-Lorraine. And remember from your reading in your Richard Maybury book that he mentioned that he had actually visited Alsace-Lorraine and that the people there spoke both French and German, and you can go into one section of the town and go into a bakery and you think you're in France, go into another section of town, go into a bakery, and you think you're in Germany. So Alsace-Lorraine actually passed back and forth between France and Germany for many, many years. Number three, what nations were carved out of Austria-Hungary? And we did highlight those. On the map it says number 28, 29, 27, and so we'll go ahead and get the names in there. Of course, Austria and Hungary became individual countries of their own, but also Czechoslovakia was formed, and Yugoslavia was formed. Number four, what European nations ceased to exist after World War I? Remember, that would be Montenegro and Serbia. Number five, what nations existed after World War I, which had not existed before World War I? So I'm going to highlight that area there We have number 22, number 23, number 24, 25, 26, but then also number 30. All of those were created after World War One. Many of them were taken away from Russia, as a matter of fact. So let's go ahead and list what those countries are. They are Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Number 6, Romania's borders were expanded after the war. What nations lost land to that expansion? And we took a look at that, and that was Austria-Hungary. And finally, number 7, Bulgaria lost land primarily to what nation? And we also checked that out before we scooted back up here, and that was to Greece. All right, now we're going to finish up the 10 deadly ideas that lead to war. Last week we spoke about the Pax Romana. Remember that literally that just means Roman peace, but the idea that we can restore the peace and the grandeur and the empire that once was Rome has haunted the European imagination since the fall of Rome. We also discussed fascism. Remember that fascism primarily is a marriage of government and big business. And Richard Maybury emphasized that fascist rulers often are very pragmatic in how they rule. If this week the pragmatic thing to do is to promote the welfare of a certain group of people, then this week that's what we're going to do. If next week it's more pragmatic to jail them all and send them to concentration camps, then next week that's what we're going to do. And so fascist leaders primarily do whatever will be best for themselves to keep them in power. Leading to number 3, love of political power. I feel like that's fairly self-evident. We see that even in the United States, where members of Congress will be there for decades and decades and decades, just staying in power. We see that with senators, also not just members of Congress. They'll be sick, they'll be on their deathbed, and by golly, they're not going to resign because they don't want to give up that political power. Sometimes it is their political party that doesn't want them to give up that power. It wouldn't be a good time for you to resign right now because the wrong kind of governor is in place and they will appoint somebody from the wrong party, and so they're encouraged to stay when they really should be stepping down. All right, number 4, global protection. We also discussed last week that is the urge of a country, specifically in this case the United States, to protect any citizen, any business that originates from the United States that goes someplace else and takes a risk and gets in trouble. And so the United States government has the tendency to go and bail people out fairly often. Number 5, interests. Usually that has to do with nebulous ideas about such and such policy being in the best interest of the United States. Usually the reason why it's in the interest of the United States isn't defined well. Cost externalization. He mentioned in the book that when France and when Great Britain wanted to buy arms from the United States during World War I, they didn't want Germany to be able to destroy those arms before they received them. And so rather than paying to protect them as they were transported from the United States to either Britain or France, the United States Navy tried to protect them, or they hid them in ocean liners and tried to protect them with civilians, as in the case of the Lusitania. Finally, last week, we discussed manifest destiny, how that is the urge, specifically of politicians, to expand their borders. In the case of European powers, the manifest destiny to conquer the entire world and spread their empire. In the case of the United States, up until up until the Spanish-American War, it was just that urge to fill the entire North American continent. So this week we read about the last 3 of the 10 deadly ideas that lead to war, at least according to Richard Maybury. And the first of those is number 8, the white man's burden, or Anglo-Saxonism. And see, Here is a political cartoon drawn to promote the white man's burden. The one individual there you'll recognize as Uncle Sam. The other individual there is the symbol for John Bull. When we were talking about political cartoons from the American Revolution, we saw several depictions of John Bull way back last semester. Notice that each of these Anglo-Saxon men are carrying a burden, a basket on their back filled with tribal people who look somewhat wild. Notice that both of them are headed up the hill, and when they reach up the hill, they're going to reach something really good. It looks like maybe Lady Liberty is up there, and they are forcibly forcing these tribal people to become civilized for their own good, even though they don't want to, obviously, in the picture. And so the idea, or at least the idea for the term, the white man's burden, came from poet Rudyard Kipling, and he published a poem in February of 1899 entitled The White Man's Burden. And I just wanted to share just a little bit of it with you. It says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed." In other words, send forth your best children. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. And so I hope you're capturing the flavor of that. He acknowledges that these tribal people don't want the white man to come in and conquer them. And so because of that, they are sullen. They are newly caught, almost like slaves. But what they don't realize, says Rudyard Kipling, is that we're there to serve them, to redeem them from being a devil, to educate them so that they're no longer childlike. And so it's a fairly offensive poem, but it was an idea that did capture the imagination of the populace at the time. And so that's why Richard Maybury wanted to bring it forth. One of the things that Richard Maybury said was that during this time period, that in his research he found a proliferation of depictions of Santa Claus with American flags, showing Santa Claus as being uniquely American. Now, it could be argued that Santa Claus is uniquely American in that the idea of the big fat man with the long white beard was an American idea. It may have been similar to Father Christmas or Saint Nicholas, but wasn't exactly. So anyway, I did some research, and I also found a lot of these depictions of Santa Claus with his patriotic gear that come from around this same time period. However, in doing further research, in another thing that Richard Maybury said, he mentioned that at one point he had gone to a museum and he had seen this lithograph of two sleeping children. We have Santa Claus there, and Santa Claus does indeed have his little flag. And Richard Maybury said that when he was looking at it, he was appalled because he saw a group of American soldiers going up a hill and conquering dark-skinned people, and he said that that probably was a depiction of the conquest of the Philippines. And then in another part of this particular lithograph, there was a white man with a dark-skinned man on his shoulders, and that was a unique depiction of the white man's burden. And so, like I said, I wanted to research that also, and I want to disagree with Richard Maybury here. First of all, this was a cartoon by the political cartoonist Thomas Nast. You should be familiar with him. We looked at a lot of his political cartoons when we were discussing the Civil War. This particular lithograph was one of his few non-political cartoons that he drew. It's actually considered to be the best non-political cartoon that he drew, and so that's probably why it was on display in the museum that Richard Maybury visited. It was drawn in 1872, and if you recall, Rudyard Kipling wrote his poem, The White Man's Burden, in 1890. Also, 1872 was long before the Spanish-American War and long before the conquest of the Philippines. And so as I was looking at this, what I noticed is that this is actually a depiction of them dreaming about nursery rhymes and familiar stories. And so I just wanted to point out some of the nursery rhymes that are on here for you. We have Mother Goose flying there. She kind of looks like a witch to me, but I researched this and apparently that's Mother Goose. We have the cow jumping over the moon. We have, I thought maybe this was Jack and Jill. We do have Jack and Jill. They're here falling down the hill. So that first one I think is probably, instead of being Jack and Jill, maybe Little Tommy Stout. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that particular nursery rhyme. It's ding dong bell, pussy's in the well. Who put him in? Little Johnny Thin. And who pulled him out? Little Tommy Stout. What a naughty boy was that to try to drown poor Pussycat, who never did him any harm, but killed the mice in his father's barn. Now, beyond the nursery rhymes, we also have some fairy tales. Right here we have Cinderella, and we have Puss in Boots. We have Little Red Riding Hood and Little Bo Peep. Little Bo Peep would have been one of the nursery rhymes. In the middle there we have Old King Cole. And at the top, I think that is the Headless Horseman. It's a man on a horse and he has no head. And so Washington Irving would have published in the early 1800s and would have been familiar with Thomas Nast. Rather, Thomas Nast would have been familiar with Washington Irving. And I think that this may be Rip Van Winkle coming back down the hill. Here we have a scene from William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And we have Gulliver from Gulliver's Travels. We have Robinson Crusoe. And you see behind him is Friday. And I think that the native people you see on the other side of the hill are looking over at Friday and Robinson Crusoe. And Friday's looking over at the people on the other side of the hill. And there is a United States Army coming up the hill there. I read some commentary on it, and it mentioned that the army there was the only part of it that wasn't from a familiar story, and that Thomas Nast probably included that because he was a big proponent of the United States military, and maybe he thought a young boy would have thrilled at the idea of dreaming about the United States military. But beyond there, we have Odysseus killing Polyphemus from the Odyssey, and we have Aladdin. Very few people remember that Aladdin in the original story was actually Chinese, and here Thomas Nast knows that. He depicts Aladdin as a young Chinese man. We have Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and the light-skinned man with the dark-skinned man on his back that actually comes from the story of Sinbad the Sailor. According to that story, at one point Sinbad the Sailor meets an old man who needs help crossing a stream. He allows the old man to get up on his shoulders to do that, and then the old man will not let him go. He will not get down off his shoulders, and he ends up having to trick the old man in order to get him off his shoulders. So that has nothing to do with the white man's burden, because I don't think that Sinbad the Sailor was white. He was in fact from one of the Arabian countries. So over here we have an Aesop's Fable. I think that one is The Fox and the Grapes. And there are a couple of things on here that I don't know what they are. There's a giant there with 3 heads. I can't tell you what story that comes from. There's a young girl standing in front of a giant monster in a cave. I'm not sure where that one comes from. There's a man standing by a fountain. I read that there was a popular story at the time called The Water of Life, and so it was an extremely popular fairy tale at the time, and that may have be what that is. And then in the center between the 2 heads, I can't tell you what story that is, but most of them I was able to find, and so I just wanted to share that with you. I some things I agree with Richard Maybury, some things I disagree with Richard Maybury, and in this particular case, I think he got that one wrong. I probably spent too much time on that, so we're going to move on. Number 9 in the list of the 10 deadly ideas that lead to war was alliances. And so I'm going to pull this map back up. We've seen this map several weeks now. The alliances that the different countries in Europe got themselves into. Remember that after the Franco-Prussian War, that France felt like that Germany and Austria were gearing up for more wars, and so they secretly made an alliance with Russia and then later brought Britain into that alliance. Meanwhile, Germany did make an alliance with Austria and then also with Italy. And these alliances weren't necessarily above board. They didn't necessarily let everybody know, I'm in a treaty now with Russia and I'm in a treaty now with Britain. And so when World War I started, suddenly you may have declared war. For example, you may have declared war on little Serbia, and that's all you planned to fight with was little Serbia. Well, suddenly you're fighting with the people of Great Britain, and you hadn't even intended to do that. And so that was one reason why, when Woodrow Wilson was trying to help negotiate a peace at the end of World War I, that he came up with 14 points that he wanted as part of the treaty. And one of those points was to have no more secret alliances. He thought that those were a bad deal for everybody. And the final deadly idea that leads to war, according to Richard Maybury, is the glory of war. So the glory of war is basically the pomp, the pageantry, the songs, the medals, the parades, the uniforms, the speeches, and anything else that is meant to pull on people's emotion and promise young men a chance to be a hero. So here we have a photograph of a recruitment parade that took place in England. We get everybody excited, and at the end of it, we have recruiters come through and try to get the young men who were at the parade to join the army. A similar recruitment parade in France, and in Germany, and in Austria. The United States also had recruitment parades like that. And then also the role of the media in hyping the war and getting people all excited about the war. We have here a headline, Austro-Hungarian government has declared war on Serbia. The battle rages as Serbs invade Austria. Britain declares war on Austria-Hungary. Great battle to be fought today. War declared by Germany. England will declare war on Germany this evening. Germany has been invaded by the French army. And war declared, all Europe in turmoil. Now, in his chapter on the glory of war, if you recall, Richard Maybury primarily focused on what war really entails, the death, the dirt, the grit, in contrast to what people thought they were signing up for when they signed up to go to war. And I did want to just briefly go over some of the technological advancements in war that the men who fought in World War I had to deal with. If you recall, when we discussed the Civil War, we mentioned that one reason it was such a deadly war and such a brutal war was because at the beginning of the war, the generals were trying to use the same tactics that they had used 50, 60, 70 years earlier, and that the technology had advanced so much that they were sending the men into killing machines. Similar story with World War I, that the generals were continuing to try to use old battle techniques. You know, we're going to line up and we're going to run at each other. But now they were facing increased technology, and at the beginning of the war, it just led to hundreds of thousands in casualties. And so one area that was advanced during World War I was the area of transportation. So many of the armies literally marched into World War I on foot and using horses. And by the end of the war, they had produced hundreds of military vehicles. They had advanced the technology in flying airplanes, and they were able to use them to a certain extent to bomb each other, and had fights, aerial fights during World War I, plane to plane. And even though tanks had already been invented before World War I, they perfected the tank during World War I. In addition, there was advancements in the kinds of firepower that they were able to use. the rifles that they used during World War One. Some places I read that you could shoot 15 bullets per minute. Other places I read you could shoot up to 20 bullets per minute. I guess it probably depended on how good a shot you were and how quickly you were able to reload. So that was pretty significant. In addition, the Gatling gun had been improved, and they had true machine guns during World War One. And so that was one of the things that was very deadly, that you're using old techniques of battle. All right, men, charge at each other, and you're shooting machine guns at each other. And so literally hundreds of thousands of men were killed. In addition, cannons got bigger and bigger and bigger. This last one was called Big Bertha. She was made by the German army, and she struck fear into the hearts of anyone who faced Big Bertha. Trench warfare also is something that was not invented during World War One. I remember, having grown up on Long Island, that there are actually trenches that were dug by the colonial army during the Battle of Long Island very early in the war that are still there today. So trench warfare wasn't anything new. At the beginning of World War One, the trenches were very shallow, they were temporary, and they were expected to remain shallow and temporary because they thought that they would be able to take land from each other just like they had in previous wars. Because of the advances in the technology that we just mentioned, they weren't able to do that. And so they had to dig in, and the trenches ended up becoming mini homes for everybody. They slept in the trenches, they ate in the trenches, they cooked in the trenches, they went to the bathroom in the trenches, and the trenches got quite unhygienic because of that. They were not safe or healthy places to be. I wanted to show you a layout of some of the trenches and point out some of the features. First, you'll notice the jaggedness of the trenches as you trace along them, that there are little bays in them. And the bays were there on purpose. It was thought that, for example, if a bomb was thrown down into the trench, that the destruction of one bay was preferable to the destruction of the entire trench. And so whatever was thrown into one of those bays would stay in one of those bays, whether that was poison gas or fire or a bomb, that it would stay in that one bay. Unfortunately, the men in that bay would all be dead, but it would save the lives of the other men along the trench. So at the front, they had the front line trench. Those were the men who could at any moment be ordered to go over the top and run into no man's land and try and fight their way into the trenches of the other side. Behind the front line was the support trench. The support trench would have been people who were there to cook and take care of the needs of the people in the front line trench. They would not have been asked to go over the top. They were there to pick up dead bodies, to clean up messes, to cook, and things like that. Behind the support trench was the reserve trench, and those were people who were recovering from their time at the front line. Now, they tried to keep morale up by not forcing people in the front line trench to stay there for very long. You had to stay there for a week or two, and then you got shifted back to the reserve trench, and the people in the support trench would move up, and the people in the reserve trench would move up to the support trench, and so they would rotate, so that it would keep morale up. If you thought that I'm going to be in the front line trench until I die, then you might just give up. But if you thought I'm only going to be in the front line trench for 2 more days and then I get to go to the reserve trench, then you're more likely to continue to fight and continue to want to survive and to continue to follow orders. So notice also that there were communication trenches, and actually there were a lot of communication trenches. So that's how they were able to go back and forth between the trenches. Now we get to the part that I hate talking about, just because I think that the technology of poison gas and flamethrowers was a step too far, in my opinion. But during World War One, they did develop poison gases that they would shoot at one another, and it was actually quite effective and quite frightening. You notice in that one picture that there's the white clouds going across no man's land into the trenches of the other side. And so Germany was the first to develop the poison gas. They developed chlorine gas. Chlorine gas is extremely painful. You breathe it in and it begins to immediately burn your esophagus, your mouth, down into your bronchial tubes, just burns it. And it is possible actually to survive, believe it or not, a chlorine gas attack, but it's also possible to die from it. And what happens is that your lungs begin to fill up with lymph, which is trying to keep your body's generating that to try to keep infection at bay. But then because there's so much damage in your lungs from the chlorine gas, that it just fills it up and you end up drowning. When Germany first started using the chlorine gas, the Allies, of course, accused them of being cruel, horrible, you shouldn't do that. And then they quickly developed their own poison gases. The French developed a gas called phosgene gas. The chlorine gas was, even though we saw it in the black and white picture, it looked like a white cloud coming. It actually was not a white cloud. It would be a green cloud coming towards you. And it struck terror into people when they saw that coming toward them. The phosgene gas was colorless and it was odorless, and it was actually a lot more deadly than the chlorine gas was because it was colorless and odorless. It was heavier than air, and so it would drift across the battlefield, or rather across no man's land, and drift down into the trenches, and it would stay there because it was so heavy. Because it was colorless and odorless and it didn't burn initially, you would breathe it in and breathe it in and breathe it in. And actually 85% of people who ended up dying from gas attacks during World War One died from this phosgene. Eventually they did develop gas masks. Phosgene gas, though, because it was colorless and odorless, by the time you realized what was going on and put on your gas mask, you might already have breathed in so much that you would die from it. And so it was a pretty bad gas. In addition to the phosgene gas, they also developed mustard gas. Now, mustard gas, you didn't have to breathe it in to kill you because it would burn your body. Once it hit you, it would blind people and cause terrible burns. And in just a moment, I'll show you some photos of that. Photos you may not want to see, actually. But in addition to poison gas, they also developed flamethrowers, and that also struck fear into the hearts of people who saw the flamethrowers coming toward them. So here's just some photographs from World War One. This first photograph was taken at the Battle of Ypres, and it was taken of the German soldiers letting off chlorine gas for the first time. I guess they wanted to immortalize that in photographs. I'm not sure exactly why they wanted to do that, but they did. And here we have a group of, I think these are French soldiers, and they are getting ready to let off the gas of their own, probably phosgene. This is a photograph of a group of British soldiers who have been blinded either by chlorine gas or by mustard gas. When I grabbed the photo from the internet, I knew what it was, but I've forgotten now. Here we see men down in a trench, and they've got their gas masks on. This is a photograph of a young man who has been burned by mustard gas, and you can see the huge, giant welts on his body where he's been burned, and his face is just bright red and burned. And here are a couple of soldiers who have had their faces burned, their hands burned after a gas attack. So we're going to go ahead, and Richard Maybury asked you to watch a clip from an Indiana Jones TV show. The clip he wanted you to see was The Trenches of Hell, and so I'm going to go ahead and show that to you. When we're done with that, I'm also going to show you a clip of some men actually having some fun in the trenches. And after we've watched both of those video clips, I'll come back and tell you what's going on.
Quiet.
Yes, quiet. And now we begin again. I'll see you afterwards, Bernard.
Yes, Alain. Must. It's broken. Andy, give me your mask.
I can't.
They're not attacking! They will! What in hell's name is that?
I don't know.
Mother of God!
Ah, that's better. Right, lads, you can take your masks off now. Masks off, stand down. Not you, Leary. Sentry. Yes, sir.
Bombed last night and bombed the night before. Gonna be bombed tonight if we never get bombed anymore. When we're bombed, we're scared as we can be. God stop the bombing men from higher Germany. They're over us, they're over us. One shell hole for just the four of us. Thank your lucky stars there are no more of us, 'cause one of us could fill it all alone. Gas last night and gas the night before. Going to get gas tonight if we never get gassed anymore. When we're gassed, We're sick as we can be, 'cause phosgene and mustard gas is much too much for me. They're warning us, they're warning us. One respirator for the four of us. Thank your lucky stars that three of us can run, so one of us can use it all alone.
So the second clip that I wanted to show you and did was the one of the men singing down in the trenches. Remember that there was no television at the time, they didn't have radio, and so as in battles past, for thousands of years, the men had to figure out ways to keep up their morale themselves. When we first were talking about World War I shared some of the World War I songs with you, and in addition to singing down in the trenches to try and keep their morale up and playing simple games like card games and things like that, they also from time to time would come up from the trenches and play soccer. They called it football. I read a memoir from one British soldier, and they discovered that if they came up and played soccer, he called it football, that the Germans would not shoot at them, and so every day they would have a little soccer match just to get some exercise and keep their morale up. So one of their commanding officers decided, well, if they're not shooting at us, why waste our time playing soccer? Why don't we go up and we'll do some marching drills? And so he made them go up and they did some marching drills, and they started being shot at by the Germans. Overnight, someone from the German army had snuck over and left them a note, and the next morning they found a note from the Germans that said, "We enjoy watching you play soccer, but we do not enjoy watching you do your marching drills, and so if you continue to do marching drills, we will shoot you." So, ways that they were able to let off some steam. Richard Maybury also mentioned that there were times during the war where they could actually even show kindness to one another. He mentioned the Christmas Truce. And so I did want to show you some pictures of the Christmas Truce before we move on. And so the Christmas Truce occurred in 1914. It started with German soldiers collecting little Christmas trees and lighting candles and starting to sing Christmas carols, and the British soldiers in the area started singing back to them, and the next thing you know, the Germans kind of popped their head up and nobody shot at them, and so then the British popped their heads up and nobody shot at them, and they came out into no man's land, and they ended up eating together and exchanging gifts. And so I just wanted to show you some pictures from that. So here we have the soldiers mixing and socializing with one another. Here we have some commanding officers doing the same. They played soccer and exchanged things like cigarettes. And they talked and they ate together and gave each other gifts and generally had a wonderful Christmas Eve. It started in one area and it moved on down the trenches until the whole entire trench the whole entire front had called a truce. In some areas it lasted just Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. In other areas along the front line it lasted until New Year's Eve. And so the sad part is that all of the countries involved, the governments of those countries, made it illegal to have a Christmas truce after that 1914 Christmas truce. Richard Maybury, though, pointed out that by 1916 that morale had gotten so low that there began to be some major mutinies all along the front lines. There were Russian mutinies, there were Austrian mutinies, there were French mutinies, there were German mutinies, just all across the front line. I'd like to share one more video clip with you. Not surprisingly, because of the horrors of the war that many of the frontline soldiers developed, they called it shell shock at the time. Today we would call it PTSD. Often it would hit when a soldier was told to go over the top. he would go over the top and then he would freeze. And once you develop shell shock, then you were no longer useful on the front line, and they would send you back, often to a military hospital, hopefully to be cured of your shell shock. I'm not sure that there could be a cure to that. So I'm going to show you a short clip of that was taken at a hospital that tried to cure men of shell shock by giving them physical therapy, occupational therapy, and things like that. So Richard Maybury also shared with you this famous quote by British politician Winston Churchill, just a poignant end to our study of World War I. Churchill said, "America should have minded her own business and stayed out of the war. If you hadn't entered the war, the Allies would have made peace with Germany in the spring of 1917. Had we made peace then, there would have been no collapse in Russia, followed by communism, and Germany would not have signed the Versailles Treaty, which has enthroned Nazism in Germany. If America had stayed out of the war, all of these isms wouldn't today be sweeping the continent in Europe and breaking down parliamentary government. And if England had made peace early in 1917, it would have saved over 1 million British, French, and American and other lives." Before we finish for today, I wanted to mention that for your homework this week, in addition to going ahead and reading chapter 18 and 19 and filling in some information about Warren G. Harding as president and Calvin Coolidge as president, we are going to be picking back up with our critical thinking assignments. And so for lesson 30, I'm asking you to read excerpts from 2 different historians who talk about why the United States entered World War I. And just like when we read the historians' perspectives of the Civil War, I think it's valuable to look at how time changes people's perspective. And so one of the historians was writing in 1934, the other historian was writing in 1954, and so just a matter of 20 years, I want you to compare the perspectives of the two historians. In addition to that, we are also going to be filling in a chart on a worksheet. I'd like you to read the information about Versailles and the League of Nations and what Woodrow Wilson had in mind. There's a list here of his 14 points. And then you're supposed to evaluate whether the countries that were there to discuss the terms of the Treaty of Versailles would have agreed with the point that Wilson was trying to make. Now, this is just your opinion, but I would like you to try to make educated opinions. For example, number 1 says open covenants of peace. Woodrow Wilson said we need to stop having these secret, behind-the-scenes alliances, that every covenant of peace needs to be open. That way, if someone declares war on little Serbia, they'll know that they're also going to war with Great Britain. People need to know that before they make the decision to declare war on somebody. And so I would propose to you that everybody there would have disagreed with that one. So you would put an X for France disagreed with that one, England disagreed with that one, Italy disagreed with that one, Germany disagreed with that one, because they all did, because they'd all been guilty of doing that. Number 2 says freedom of navigation upon the seas. I'm going to guess that Germany didn't care about that at that point. Probably would have agreed, yeah, we need to have free navigation upon the seas, but England had the biggest navy at the time. I'm going to guess that England would have disagreed with that one and nixed that one. And so just go down and read each one. Hopping down to Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro should be evacuated. Just Google and see who had invaded them during World War I, and you know that that's the country that disagreed with that part of the 14 points. I also want to point out number 14, a general association of nations must be formed. As you read about Wilson, you'll find out that he was willing to get rid of everything else in order to just keep his idea for a League of Nations. So they all agreed with him on that one. Ironically, it was the United States Senate that did not agree with that one, and so we never even became a member of the League of Nations, even though of his 14 points, that was practically the only one that ended up going through. So once again, don't leave this blank. Go ahead and fill it in. Once again, it's your opinion, but try to make an educated guess rather than just randomly putting X's on it. And we'll go ahead and end there for today. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to email me.